Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. In today's episode, we meet Julie M. Green, a Kingston-based writer whose words have appeared in the Globe and Mail, Chatelaine, Today's Parent, and the Washington Post. Julie's forthcoming book, Motherness, a Memoir of Generational Autism, Parenthood, and Radical Acceptance, explores what it means to parent and to be an autistic person in a world still learning how to understand neurodiversity. Through her story, Julie traces a journey that begins with her son's diagnosis and, years later, leads to her own. It's a book about family, self-discovery, and the power of acceptance, written with humor, honesty, and compassion. We talk about how writing became a form of healing, what radical acceptance really looks like, and how seeing autism through a generational lens changes everything we think we know about identity and understanding. This episode was recorded in late October 2025. Here is my conversation with Julie M. Green. Hello, Julie. Welcome to the program. Nice to have you.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
Let's start with this. A few weeks ago, well, first of all, we are recording this particular episode at the tail end of October 2025. And a few weeks ago, U.S. President Donald Trump made a statement at a press conference indicating that it was the administration's opinion that if women took acetaminophen while they were pregnant, there was a possibility that there could be an autism diagnosis with respect to the unborn child. And I'm looking to get your view on that particular statement.
You're diving right in there, aren't you?
Oh, yeah.
That's fine. Yeah, at the time, nobody is surprised, but at the time, I know I spoke to the Canadian press about it because it just harkens back to kind of the dark ages of blaming mothers, which, decades ago in the 1950s, there was a theory that mothers being emotionally cold caused autism. And that just took so many decades and a lot of science to finally, dismantle that thinking and all that mom blame. And of course, unfortunately, a lot of this has resurged, and a lot of expecting moms are terrified. They're contacting their doctors. They're thinking, what did I do? And the very sad part of it is it's really not rooted in science. It's not robust science. People need to take their cues from science, established studies, peer-reviewed, large samples. It's just frightening to me that someone in power is just making these statements that are frankly fear-mongering, ignorant, and it's just creating a lot of shame in moms and a lot of paranoia. And I mean, we do know that there are environmental factors, but it's very complex. The research has been going on for a very long time. This is not just something that has started with this administration wanting to look into it.
Yeah.
And what we do know categorically is that autism is overwhelmingly genetic. There have been studies, as in millions of kids, and there is a very solid, proven hereditary link. Is that the only thing? I'm sure there are other factors, but it's not Tylenol. And it is overwhelmingly genetic. So, it's just sad for me, and frankly infuriating as a mom, that we're being blamed again, that there's all this paranoia. Even if you took away all the Tylenol, which, again, if you look into it, like autism existed long before Tylenol was available, but whatever. Autism would still exist because it is hereditary.
What's also interesting too is the fact that I think it's the Attorney General of the state of Florida is taking the makers of Tylenol to court over this issue. So
Yeah.
what comes out of this trial will be interesting.
Yeah.
I have a question. When you have somebody of the influence that the US president has, how do you counteract that particular train of thought?
Yeah, it's also just sad too because I feel like we'd made such progress in terms of the way people think about autism. We were moving away from this narrative of it being like a tragedy and a curse. And I mean, some elements. I've still read comments, people saying, "No, I'd rather my child was dead than autistic,"
Yeah.
which is feels great as an autistic person to hear that. So I feel like, unfortunately, this is like taking us backwards from a very things had been improving, and we had more language and more, they call it neuroaffirming language surrounding autism, and this whole concept of biodiversity. We have neurodiversity, that it's just a variation in the way that we are wired.
Mhm.
So yes.
And that leads into my next question very nicely. When we do these kinds of podcasts, at least I found anyway, is that sometimes we get into words that are not in common usage among the populace as a whole. So
Mhm.
you just used one that was on my list that's neurodivergent. Can you explain? There's a couple of these I'd like to get an explanation on. So as we go forward in our chat, we are armed with an idea of what we're talking about. So, how would you define again neurodivergent?
The idea was that it's kind of akin to biodiversity, that there is a neurodiversity and just this natural variation. So neurodiversity refers to kind of everybody and the natural variation, and neurodivergent is referring to people, who, well, not diverge from the norm, but just who are divergent, I guess. So I think within that you have autism, you have ADHD, dyslexia, different learning capacities, and it's just a way of pointing to that difference.
The wiring is
Mhm.
different. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you
We
talk
we
about,
liken it, like when I explained it to my son when he was young, it was kind of like a Mac versus Windows sort of thing. You
that's
know,
a good
it's
one.
just
I like that.
it's
Yeah.
it's different. It's just different. One is not superior or inferior to the other. Well, depending who you ask. But and again, it's a good analogy because you have Bill Gates and Steve Jobs both on the spectrum. So
Yeah.
anyway.
That's a phrase too that you hear a
Hmm.
lot
Hmm.
on the spectrum. Can you give me some sense as to a very generalized view of what on the spectrum means?
Yeah, I picture it. I think some people get led astray because they picture it like this linear thing where you have severe people at one end and mild people with autism at the other end, and it's not really like that. It's kind of like, I picture it as a constellation where you have, because autism, to be diagnosed, there are certain commonalities no matter where you fall. So you have issues with often sensory issues, things that people are particularly sensitive or sensory seeking. You have communication issues, social challenges. There are these commonalities. So, for instance, and these days it's categorized in different levels, but essentially it's not a linear thing. It's more like a spectrum in the way that people are affected. So we all have these sort of core challenges, I guess, or traits, more, it's more appropriate to call it. But depending on the person, it varies. So, for example, I am articulate. You can hear me speaking. The next, someone else may not be able to speak, but I might be quite really struggle with, say, sensory issues, or very restricted behaviors, whereas the person who's non-speaking may not really have as prominent sensory issues. So
Hmm.
there's so much very so the spectrum is like we're all kind of in the same net or under the same umbrella, but there's so much variability in terms of how that looks. And it's hard as a community because it can kind of create a divide where people will look at someone like me who's like middle-aged and go, how the heck she can't be autistic because she looks nothing like my nephew who's, you know, not speaking that much and whatever. But essentially, there are these core similarities. And to be diagnosed, you must present some traits within
Hmm.
those areas, and it has to be significant enough that it affects kind of your day to day living. So when people say, oh, we're all like a little bit autistic, well, it's a bit like, no, we're not all OCD, just because you like to wash your hands and you maybe don't like germs, you're not the same as someone who can't leave the house for 2 hours or, because um, their needs are that intense. So you can't quite equate the two, but the spectrum is broad, but
Hmm.
we do all share these kind of hallmark traits to varying degrees. And it varies even on the day, I may have some days where, oh boy, a lot more autistic. I can't function as well. And other days, just depending on capacity and stuff, it might not be as noticeable to me
Hmm.
and to others.
When you decided to write the book, was it something that you had thought about doing all along, or was it something that got generated by some of the articles you've written for various publications?
Yeah, I mean, I had been a parenting writer for a really long time. Initially, I was a parenting writer. Well, initially, I studied writing, so I was writing fiction. I was not in this realm at all. And then my son was born, and when he was a toddler, I started writing for a parenting site. And then eventually, when he was diagnosed at 3, and it was such a learning curve for me, which, it probably is for a lot of listeners, but until you're thrown in the deep end and you have to learn all the things about autism. So then I started writing a little bit about autism and parenting and that side of things for, different newspapers and magazines. And then it wasn't really until 5 years ago when I ended up getting my own diagnosis and I was trying to go, holy heck, trying to process that. I was 44 and it's like, wow, that puts your whole life in a completely different light. So I was looking back on a lot of things that had happened to me. And just in that process of sort of figuring things out, I thought, well, this is really interesting to me how my experience compares with my son. Some ways it's similar, some ways it's different. And I used to say it's like a Venn diagram, like we met somewhere in the middle. But again, it's a spectrum. You think, how, like, for the longest time, I thought there's no way I can be autistic because we're so different in so many ways. But there was this overlap. So I thought that would kind of make an interesting frame for the book to follow my parenting journey from the time I was pregnant to the time my son was 13, kind of interspersed with my own experiences growing up through childhood, teenage years, early adulthood, and just looking how similar and different our experiences could be, and adding a little bit of context in the way of research and things like that. Not heavy research, but just enough to kind of explain, because each chapter or section is about kind of a different aspect of the autistic experience, I guess.
There was a lot going on when your son was born or just before. Now, I gather around the same time you were returning to Canada from the UK, where you had been, and your son was born here or there.
He was born in the UK.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's born in the UK, you come to Canada, you get a diagnosis for your son when he's 3. What kind of support was there at that particular time for folks in your situation?
Not a lot.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, we were just floored. Honestly, I think we had a call with a social worker. You get this 10-page report with all this jargon you don't understand, let alone the whole emotional side of things. Like, frankly, it would have been nice maybe even to have some counseling on the emotional side. You're kind of just sent, here you go, you're sent on your
Hmm.
way. You should get therapy, this type of therapy for your child as soon as possible. You fill out all these forms again and again, hour-long phone calls. You have to say the same information. Like, it was not a consolidated process. I hope now that it's different, that you get one worker who kind of helps you navigate all of it. But we really felt back then that we were fending for ourselves. This would have been around 2011, 2012.
Hmm.
Fortunately, one good thing that happened was there was a parenting course or workshop that we were sent on. It was largely on, how to parent. So again, there was a little bit of like kind of implied mom blame in there. But
Hmm.
I had actually met a couple moms at this group who were really on the ball, and it was kind of through them that I found out, oh, you can get this sort of funding. You're eligible for this. Apply for this. I'll send you the link. It wasn't that I had a social worker or one person who was actually helping me through this. I actually found a lot of resources and help through a couple moms I found who had just scrambled around and found these things for
Hmm.
themselves. So it was not ideal, I feel. I would like to think that it's come a long way since then, I hope.
There were a few stories in the book about taking your son to school and the
Mm.
issues of him being in a classroom and then the teachers basically saying, okay, he has to go back home, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that is really an extremely common refrain, unfortunately. And I think that does go on a lot today from what you hear on parent forums and continually getting calls to pick up your child. Either they can't cope or the teacher can't cope or, any number of issues. So it got to the point I was working part-time and had luckily a very flexible remote job, but it was still part-time work. And ultimately, I had to quit my job, as many parents do. There's often, that's the irony too. Sometimes you don't have funding and you're scrambling to try to pay for therapies for your child. And one parent or another, often the mother ends up having, or whoever has, the lower paid job or
Hmm.
whatever. Often one of the parents, if there are two parents in the equation, have to give up work. For single parents, I honestly don't know how it's even possible. Because yeah, that's the reality with school. Unfortunately, it's still really difficult. Schools, a lot of teachers are very well intentioned, but they do not have enough support. They don't have enough training or resources, and it has just become worse,
Yeah.
I think,
Not
through
enough money in the
cuts and
system. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, and again, this is not going in tandem. The rate of children who need support is rising, and yet the rate of support available is going
Hmm.
down. So there's something very, very wrong. So we cycled through about five different schools, I think, by the time my son was maybe 10.
That makes it really difficult.
Yeah.
Now, the book includes humor alongside some
Mm.
of the honesty that you're sharing with folks. How important was it for you to balance the light and the dark?
Absolutely. I was very conscious about that, not only because I just wanted to shift that narrative. I didn't want a doom and gloom book anyway. Like, who wants to read that? But it's also not accurate because, at least in our household, it's not tragic. Things are very hard at times, but we laugh a lot. And my kid is hilarious. He's always saying or doing, sometimes things are a little outrageous, but also just, it's just, my editor said, she was shocked too. She said, I'm dead inside, but you just had me dying with laughter a lot of times. And I think that's really important because I didn't want to paint this as another sad story of autism where it's like this cross to bear for parents and it's just so horrible and we have to overcome it. And I'm just so tired of that narrative. And there are still books being published that are, in that vein. And
Yeah.
that's, I think, what this administration is trying to bring all that back. And frankly, it's just not my reality. And it's not the reality of a lot of parents out there and a lot of families. Our kids are beautiful. We love our kids. And we're just trying to have a world that supports us better and
Yeah.
understands us.
One of the humorous episodes that I enjoyed reading through was the business of the influence of music.
Hmm.
And in particular, the fact that your son was a big fan of the Beatles, because I'm a big fan of the Beatles as well, but in particular, the song "When I'm 64"
Oh, yeah.
was, where did that come from? That particular song.
I have no idea. I've heard since then. I think there's another author who's written, an autistic author or actually I'm not sure if the author is autistic, but his son equally had an obsession with the Beatles, and he wrote an entire book about their connection through, unbeknownst to me, like I had published this essay like many, many years ago separately. And then I thought, oh, I'm going to add that to the book and expand on it and talk about my own love of music. But there's something about the Beatles. I have no idea what it is. There's something that's really accessible, even to autistic or not, just
Hmm.
to all across all generations, all age groups. And I think 'cause some of the songs are just so playful and the language, I don't know. My son just latched onto it, and when he latches onto something, it was sudden and it was intense. I don't want to totally give spoilers, but like at one point, he knew the exact length to the second of every song, and it was just 24/7 to the point where, as much as I adore the Beatles, it was much. It
It
was
was
much.
overkill. Yeah.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden, just as quickly as it came, we had about a year of that. And then it just went and made way for the next intense interest, which was, I don't know, back then it was probably like Pokemon or something, whatever the flavor was. So, but it was very cool for us to connect in that way. But that song, I never want to hear that song again.
Can you tell the story of taking Carson to his first live performance, and it was a Beatles tribute band
Mhm.
that the family was going to see?
Yeah, I don't want to spoil too
Oh,
much,
okay.
but it's always tricky. I can say that it's tricky as a family, as invested as he was in this, these sort of public excursions that people take for granted. It's really tricky as a family, because you never really know how it's going to go. I would take along have a bag full of things trying to prepare in case things went sideways. You have the snacks and the earplugs and all these things, but you never quite know how it's going to go. Is there going to be a meltdown? Are you going to have to race out of there with everybody staring at you and judging you and thinking your child is having a tantrum and I don't know,
Yeah.
as people do, you hear all these stories of like people looking at you and judging you. And we've had a lot of situations like that where we have to race out of the building, or you just don't know, is it going to be the best thing ever? So there's always like, you're just on eggshells. But for some mad reason, I decided to buy tickets to this matinee performance, and it was a beautiful thing, short-lived as it was.
Well, we won't spoil the story, but it's well
Cool.
worth reading, that's for sure.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
When you discovered your son's autism and then years later you discovered your own, how do the two experiences differ emotionally?
Oh, yeah, quite different, I suppose. I mean, I'd had a hard time, I guess, from the get-go when my son was born. He had, again, I've written about that in the early chapters. He had very intense, what they thought was colic, which may have really just been first signs of autism, frankly. Cried a lot. And I just felt very inadequate as a parent. I had, again, another very common thing I didn't understand, but I had postpartum depression. I really struggled as a new mom. So I blamed myself a lot. And then obviously, He grew into a toddler who was still very challenging, still prone to a lot of what we now know are meltdowns. So yeah, I had a really tough time. So when he was actually diagnosed, in a way, it was like, okay, this is not something I've done wrong. So it was kind of vindicating in a way to know that, okay, you're not imagining things. He is struggling, and there is something kind of different about him that isn't just a direct result of what you're doing as a parent. So in a sense, it was like such a steep learning curve, but it was validating in a strange way because I stopped blaming myself. I mean, I did wonder, what did I do? At that time, I wasn't thinking it's a hereditary thing. So there was that element of me looking back going, oh, what did I do when I was pregnant? And all the stuff that's coming back that we talked about. And then almost 10 years later, when I realized it and was referred and assessed, I guess a kind of similar thing, because I thought, okay, there's a reason I am the way I am and why I've had certain situations in life, certain relationships have gone this way. It's not that I'm, you know, this certain flaw with my personality, that I'm there's something wrong with me. There was a kind of reason for it all along. So I guess in both senses, relief is not quite the right word, but just understanding and things falling into place, and yeah, I guess some validation. So I guess in both senses there was a similarity, I suppose, once
Hmm.
the dust settled and you kind of understood the reason for it, then there wasn't so much blame or shame and internalizing, because I'd grown up for 40 years. I mean, you still know you're different. You don't know why. Why can't I do this? What's wrong with me? You internalize all
Hmm.
these issues, and you think, oh, I'm difficult. You get these other labels, that either people give you or you just internalize yourself.
Until I read the book, I wasn't aware that there was sort of an underrepresentation of the fact that you don't hear as much about women being autistic as men. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's come to light really in the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. There's a real awareness, and I think in fact they may be adding. They're not changing the whole criteria, but I think there's an awareness now, because previously the criteria for diagnosis were very much like all the research had been historically aimed at young white boys. So anyone who fell outside of that remit, i.e., different races, girls were not identified at all, were missed. So that's starting to change now. And yeah, as I say, a big part of that population that was missed was girls, because there's a whole list of ways that it's different, but a lot of girls do something called masking, where we find ways to hide it, fake it, I guess. We can look a little bit more sociable, maybe. We can do eye contact, even though it might be uncomfortable. I was often, I guess, an observer. I was pathologically shy. That's what it was called in the 80s, early 80s when I was growing up. She's very, very shy. She's just come out of her shell. I just observed people, and I would kind of just please people, stay on the sidelines. And in that way, I kind of I'd have a friend. Um, so again, no one would assume she's autistic. What do you mean she is not lining up trains? I had collections in my room that no one could touch. Everything was in its place. There were patterns. I would still completely lose my mind if my mom said we were going to do something and then suddenly we weren't going to do it, or there was a change for whatever reason. I would just have a big tantrum. So there were kind of clues, but it was just, oh, she's very set in her ways. She's an only child. She's spoiled. She likes to get her way, or she's just incredibly shy. She'll grow out of that. It was excused in these different ways. So it didn't stand out in, I guess, historically, the picture we had of what autism looked like in boys.
Does culture play a role in all of this and how we assess people who may or may not be on some form of that spectrum?
Yeah, I think there are groups for sure that are like identified, whether they're not being brought forward. I think screening now is more people are being screened at a younger age. So maybe people are finding that. But I think, I mean, I can't really speak to that. I'm a white woman, but I know that, yeah, lots of populations were missed for different reasons, like maybe because of stigma, lack of awareness about it culturally.
Information, yeah.
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 The concept of autism being passed down, if you will, from generation to generation,
Mhm.
is that something that's generating more discussion these days?
Yeah, I think people are definitely realizing it. And I think that's was also kind of the reason where like my book slots in to that void because a lot of parents are realizing and being diagnosed after their kids are, which is the same way that it happened with me.
Hmm.
That is kind of a phenomena that's happening a lot. And I hadn't seen any of that. I had read lots of memoirs and books by autistic advocates, like young adults, or a lot of books about autism by parents and their journey parenting. But there had been to date no book, to my awareness anyway, that actually looked at that relationship of being a parent who's autistic and having raising an autistic child. But yeah, it's increasingly common, and the awareness that it's common. I'm sure, obviously there were autistic parents out there for a really long time who just didn't know it. A lot
Hmm.
of grandparents now, a lot of people in their 60s and 70s are. I've had messages, and I think that's also a thing. People are learning more and going, wow, And I
Yeah.
think it's not too late to have that understanding. And I think it's quite healing to be able to look back. I mean, some people do get quite upset thinking, I wish I'd known this 50 years ago or whatever. But I think better late than never.
Hmm. More of a general question. Is there one thing in particular that most people misunderstand about autism?
Wow, there's so many. How can we land on one thing? The one thing personally for me that I was important to talk about in the book, because it's especially isolating because my son had a lot of issues regulating. So he'd have a lot of explosive outbursts that looked like tantrums and bad behavior from the outside and was treated like bad behavior at school, was punished. As a parent, you're judged, you're not disciplining, you just need to do this, that, and the other, rather than it being like a physiological, yeah, that's what it's called, meltdown. So again, if we think of like the computer analogy again, just like shutting down.
Hmm.
So for some people that happens inwardly. For me and some autistic profiles, the process is more inward. You get sick, you can't speak, you go into this shutdown mode. But other people, it looks very externalized, and it could be aggressive, it can be, and I wish people had a little bit more understanding when kids have those outbursts, that it's not coming from a place of misbehavior. It is literally the system kind of short circuiting.
Hmm.
So really, it needs to be met with compassion and understanding that it's really a physiological thing rather than, something that needs to be disciplined or punished because it's not within the person's control in that moment.
Hmm.
So again, there's a lot of shame afterwards.
Now, what would you say to parents who are just starting down the road that you've just walked?
Oh gosh, it's a marathon. Don't get, don't be, you can't, you need to learn obviously and surround yourself with, I think community actually is the most important thing.
Yeah.
I think if I had not met those two moms in the early part of my son's journey, it was very, very isolating, very difficult time. You feel like no one knows what you're going through. We used to have really nice moments where our three families would get together and, the kids would go on the trampoline or whatever. One was nonverbal, one was verbal, but, prone to different things. And there was no explanation required. There was no apologizing if you needed to leave or if your kid was having a hard time. It was just such it was a really beautiful thing to have that. And I think that is the most important thing to as parents, or if you can with other families, to surround yourself, or at least with one other family who understands what you're going through, and where you can be with each other with no judgment. Because that the isolation is really, really terrible, and the shame that comes with that as well, because you do kind of get cut off from a lot of friends and family. Don't get it, or you can't. We struggled a lot with things like Christmas. My son would end up holed up in a room in the house, and I'd be with him, and it was, people didn't understand, or like, why can't you come to this get together? Or it can be very hard for, like, a lot of relationships fall away. And so I think that isolation and finding community, super important.
Julie, I want to thank you for sharing your story today and helping us see how understanding and acceptance can transform not just how we parent, but how we see ourselves. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much.
That was Julie M. Green, author of Motherness, a Memoir of Generational Autism, Parenthood, and Radical Acceptance, published by ECW Press in September of 2025. In our conversation, recorded in late October of 2025, Julie reminded us that understanding begins with listening, and that acceptance of others and of ourselves is often the most radical act of all. For information on buying the book, check out Julie's webpage at juliemgreen, all one word, .ca. As always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and consider rating and subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others discover the show. I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the kingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.